In episode number 1 of Project 86, we'll be installing new axle shaft bearings. This is one of those commonly overlooked items that can really bring new life to an old high-mileage car. Whether you own an SR5 or a GTS, the steps for installing the bearings are essentially the same, but make sure you order the correct parts for your car, as the SR5 and GTS utilize different size bearings. The first step is to get the car up into the air and place jack stands under the rear axle housing to ensure that it's safe to work on. Once you've verified that the car is stable and there's no risk of it falling, you can begin to loosen the rear lug nuts and remove the wheel from the car. With the rear wheel removed, the brake drum is exposed. This simply slides off the end of the hub assembly. While this job may be possible without removing the brake shoes, removing them will free up a lot of space and make the job much easier. And it only requires removing 3 springs, so there's really no reason not to. At this point, the front-facing brake shoe is completely free to be removed from the car, and the rear-facing brake shoe can simply be left hanging by the parking brake cable. In this state, the 4 nuts that hold the hub and axle assembly into the housing are clearly visible. It would be a good idea to use some sort of penetrating oil on them to free everything up. After giving the oil some time to work, you can then remove the 4 nuts using the access holes on the face of the hub. Now you're ready to remove the axle, and the easiest way to do this is by using a slide hammer. You can rent one of these for free from most auto parts stores. Once broken loose, the axle will slide out freely. The next step is definitely the most tedious part of this project. You're going to remove the bearing and the spacer from the axle by cutting a notch in them. You need to be extremely careful to not nick the dust plate or the axle while you're cutting. The only advice I can give is to take your time and constantly inspect your cuts to make sure that you haven't gone too far. Once you have a notch cut into each of the parts, they will release their tension and slide right off the axle. Once the old bearing was removed, I used a Scotch-Brite pad to clean the surface where the new bearing would be pressed on. Now you're ready to start reassembling the axle, and the first piece to go on is the dust cover. It's very important that you put this piece on first, or you'll be cutting off your new bearing and ordering another one. And with your new bearing on, you're ready to go to the press. Applying a thin layer of grease to the axle and the inner race of the bearing will aid in installation. You don't need to apply a ton of pressure once the bearing is bottomed out, just make sure it's well seated. The final piece to go on is the spacer. As you can see, one side of it is flat while the other side has a rounded edge. Make sure that the rounded part is facing away from the bearing. And just like pressing on the bearing, you don't need to apply a ton of pressure, just make sure everything is fully seated. With the axle fully assembled, the next step is to prep the housing. I started by pulling out the old axle shaft seal. Next I used a wire wheel on a Dremel tool to clean up the surface between the brake drum backing plate and the dust cover. With everything clean and ready for reassembly, I put in the new axle shaft seal. And to make sure that it was fully seated, I lightly tapped it with a wooden hammer handle. Originally there was a paper gasket behind the dust cover. Since the old one was destroyed and I didn't have a new one, I used an RTV gasket maker rated for use with gear oils in its place. And with all that done, the axle assembly is ready to go back into the housing. You can now reinstall and tighten the 4 nuts that hold everything together. Now it's just a matter of putting the brakes back together. Start by loosely fitting the brake shoes back into their positions. Then you can install the alignment pins from the back side. Now you can put the retaining springs on to hold the brake shoes in place. The last spring is definitely the most difficult to install, but get a good grip on it, pull it hard, and it'll go into place. And finally, reinstall the brake drum. With the brakes fully assembled, you can now put your wheel back on and torque down the lug nuts. After repeating all these steps on the other side, you'll be done and ready to lower the car back down. Thanks for watching this episode of Project 86, and we'll see you in the next one.